Kia ora everyone and welcome. I'm Dr. C. Rotman from Wellington, New Zealand. So I'm talking to you from the future. It's about just after 10 o'clock at night here in summer. And I am also going to do this webinar with my good friend Dr. Danielle Butler in the UK, who's having a pretty early morning. So thanks for joining us. And just to start us off, I just want to point out that the Users Technology Collaboration Program, about which Sam is going to say a few words at the end of this, is functionally and legally autonomous from the IEA Secretariat. So we are talking about the Hard to Reach Energy Users task of the Users TCP. We started it in 2019. It's an international research collaboration. We focus on how to reach energy users in both the residential and the non-residential sectors. And this task is trying to determine who they are, how many they are, where they are, how to better motivate and engage them in energy efficiency and demand-side interventions, particularly geared at changing their energy using behaviors. And so we collaborated together on creating a definition for hard to reach energy users for our task, which you can see here. It's quite broad on purpose because most people think of hard to reach energy users as low-income households who live in energy poverty or hardship, but it's actually a lot more complex than that. For example, energy users who are hard to reach can also be very high income households who use a lot more energy and therefore have a lot more potential to change, but may not care because they can afford their bills. Or it can be building operators in commercial buildings who have a lot of power over their energy consumption, but may not feel empowered by the organizational leadership to save energy. And so our hypothesis going into this task was that over a third of energy users in the world were hard to reach. And during our first lockdown in 2020, we kind of wrote an accidental book about this, characterizing the different hard to reach energy users. And we actually found to our astonishment that it's more like 3/4 of energy users. And that is, for example, because both renters and landlords are really hard to reach with various energy efficiency programs. And if you combine the commercial and the residential sector, over 60% of buildings are actually rented. Or small to medium businesses or enterprises are regarded as some of the hardest to reach energy users with various programs, and they're actually 99% of businesses in the world. And vulnerable households are not just those who are low income, who may be relatively easy to identify and find, but they're also those who suffer from various intersectionalities like minority status due to gender, age, race, ethnicity, or disability, living in geographically remote locations, or being otherwise stigmatized, criminalized, or illegitimized by society. And so we're really talking about a huge number of energy users who are not using this essential resource as efficiently as possible. And that, of course, is also exacerbating financial, social, and health vulnerabilities for them, making them harder to reach. And what we also found, including here in New Zealand, which is very lucky in terms of COVID, but they're very similar audiences in terms of how hard to reach they are to those that are also currently hard to engage in vaccination efforts. So it is something that we're learning more and more is really important to actually look at in more detail. So our shared goal in this task is to identify, define, and prioritize them and design, measure, and share effective strategies, how you can engage them, whilst also meeting access, equity, and energy service needs. Because the biggest problem is the terminology itself. The fact that they're termed hard to reach basically seems to put the onus on them, not us, the behavior changers, as we call them in this task, who are charged with motivating and engaging them in energy efficiency and conservation activities. And so our goal is to help identify and characterize them and figure out how we can help behavior changers to best engage them, whilst also serving the important equity and energy justice needs. And part of that is what we also did in the lit review, is really looking at the terminology and definitions. So we have some really brilliant collaborators around the world. We have 3 financially participating countries, New Zealand, Sweden, and the US. We have 2 co-financing countries in the UK and Canada. We work really closely with the Fuel Poverty Research Network and Professor Amy Ambrose of Sheffield Hallam University, so our Chief Science Advisor, and also the American Sea Change Institute. And Through Sea Change Institute's involvement, we have co-created the research process that we're testing and validating in field research pilots. And in this whole task, it's called the Building Blocks of Behaviour Change. You can see the reference on the bottom there. And in year 1, we undertook in-depth expert interviews and surveys, and then decided on our shared goals and objectives during the discover phase. Then we undertook a very detailed in-depth literature review on defining how to reach audiences and behaviours. And then in year 2, which is the focus of this webinar, we really honed in on the design phase. We undertook case study analyses in 8 countries to gain insights into the various engagement strategies, the content and delivery of messages, what worked, what didn't, and why. And now in year 3, we focus on the deploy phase, where we actually design, implement, and evaluate field research pilots in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in Canada. Very quickly, I just want to point to what we call the Beast, this kind of accidental giant book that we've written. It's probably one of the most in-depth reviews of the literature and characterization of how to reach audiences in all the different sectors. It's based again on stakeholder interviews, survey data of experts around the world, and over 1,000 publications. And we're gonna, it's on our website. So some key findings from this big review and analysis in year 1. The most commonly mentioned hard to reach audiences in the literature, unsurprisingly, are low-income households, but also renters and small to medium enterprises. But those with the highest energy saving potential are pretty much the flip side of them, which is high-income households, landlords, and building operators in large commercial buildings. The audience size estimates, as I said, are a lot larger than what we originally thought, and the COVID-19 impact on these audiences, especially the most vulnerable households, renters, and small to medium enterprises, has been massive. So they're a very important audience group to help with various energy efficiency and energy saving programs as well. The biggest research gaps we found were in the commercial sector outside of office buildings. For example, the municipality, university, school, and hospital sector. We did some research there in North America. Small to medium enterprises always seem to fall through the cracks. We still are not communicating and studying the multiple impacts of programs outside of energy efficiency and monetary savings. We are not collecting enough demographic data, because that definitely has a lot of impact on how well those programs actually reach certain energy users. We are not looking at psychographics enough, which is collecting data on their values, their attitudes, their knowledge, their needs, their barriers, etc. And so there is quite a lot of work that needs to be undertaken in more depth. So what we found is that these audiences are not only hard to reach, they're also underserved and under-researched by us behaviour changers in industry, government, and academia. And particularly energy justice, inequity, and stigma are key themes that we need to address more urgently and on these target audiences. And now very quickly, before I hand over to Danielle, in our year 2 research, we undertook these case study analyses in 8 countries. As I said, we looked at 19 case studies, between 1 and 5 case studies per country. Our residential sector focus was low income audiences, but with intersecting vulnerabilities. And these are examples of those that we looked at: manufactured housing, renters, Indigenous populations, underlying mental health conditions, the elderly, pregnant or single mothers with small children who also suffer from respiratory illnesses, rural and remote communities, and frontline staff. And in the commercial sector, we focused on small businesses. We developed a standardized methodology for the case study analysis, so we could do cross-country case study comparisons. It was built on the ABCDE building blocks framework. We developed a template for the case studies and interview questions, and interviewed a whole lot of program managers from these case studies, and also independent evaluators and researchers who looked at them. And they will be synthesized, analyzed, and published in a peer-reviewed cross-country case study comparison, and also a methodology process paper, which we're finishing right now for the ECEEE summer study. And I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Danielle, and she's going to tell you a little bit about the case studies.
Thanks, C. C, can you just confirm you can hear me okay?
Yes, sorry, I just turned myself on mute.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Super, thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to C's kind of given the overview of the project as a whole, so I'm going to kind of delve into some of the detail now of the specific case studies and give you a bit of an idea of what each of the participating countries looked at. First off, just to introduce the wider team, so obviously C and myself are here, but these are the case study authors across the 8 different countries. As C mentioned before, 3 are financially participating in the task, that's US, Sweden and New Zealand, and C will talk a little bit more about those case studies after I've finished. And then the UK and Canada are contributing in kind. And then we have Portugal, Italy and the Netherlands who joined us in year 2, providing case studies for the cross-country case study comparison. Just to reiterate, I think it was mentioned at the start, but the slides will be shared. So all contact details are on here. So if you wanted to contact any of the authors, please refer to the slide and the details here, or C or myself for overall project queries. See, next slide, please. Oh. Lovely. Yeah, and yeah, as with the case study authors, this slide, sorry, is just introducing the chapters themselves. All links there that will take you to the sort of the main project website, and just going to spend a few minutes now, kind of working through some of these, some of the different case studies that you can see on here, and introducing some of the projects that were included. Thanks, C. So I'm going to cover Italy, Portugal, Netherlands and the UK. So starting with Italy, we have one case study within the case study analysis here that focuses on household energy advisors. The project involved 2 parts. The Assist Together project involved 2 parts. The first focused on the education of household energy advisors, and training was sort of a recurrent theme through much of the work across the projects that we've seen where there was a focus on vulnerable energy consumers, and adopting what I'll mention throughout, but this idea of sort of a cascade model. So working with those trusted middle actors who are working on the front line with households anyway, have that experience, but training them maybe more specifically around working with people on energy matters or particularly vulnerable energy consumers. So this project involved the training and education, the training and education of household energy advisors, and then that was cascaded to reach households, and with the key hard to reach audience being low income households and energy poverty in Italy. Next slide, please, See. In Portugal, we had 2 fantastic case studies coming through. One focused again on households and working with those who might be classed as vulnerable energy consumers. So the LIGAR Energy Efficiency for All project used an index of data to identify households, and then examined experiences and the reality of energy vulnerability across 10 different selected regions, and used household interviews to explore this issue. As C mentioned before, if you could just go to the next slide, C. There is a sort of a gap identified across the literature review and in the case study analysis of a focus on small businesses and small and medium enterprises as they are referred to in England. And the Portuguese case study and the UK case study find examples of these projects. The energy efficiency in the teleharas, and my pronunciation might be wrong there, so sorry to any Portuguese colleagues, traditional commerce project involved something that is quite often seen in householder approaches to supporting those with energy vulnerability or vulnerable energy consumers, and looked at inventory mapping, but also then used this door-to-door, face-to-face approach to conduct energy audits with small businesses and to provide counselling sessions and community workshops. I just want to point out the quote on the bottom left-hand side, which is quite interesting, and again, a common finding across a number of the case studies around once it was known that the project was underway, so this idea of the importance of building trust, that it's easier for the next business managers to accept that this is a good thing. So it really is about that snowball effect, and having some of those good examples to share, and then moving on to different parts of local communities or regions. Next slide, please, Steve. The next case study analysis I'm just going to mention is from the Netherlands. So this was the Faster and Better to Zero on the Meter project. I won't attempt to pronounce the Dutch title for this project. And this one focused on social housing. So again, looking at the residential sector and focusing on vulnerable energy consumers. It was a 3-year project operating up until 2019, operating in the southern part of the Netherlands, and focused on bringing together, so this idea of co-creation and collaboration, bringing together those working in the area on housing, health and energy to focus on retrofit and zero emission targets. The project was funded by a European programme, and it was conducted, as I said, across 16 municipalities, 16 partner municipalities. And the main behaviour around this was around the idea of co-creation and collaboration. They operated as a pilot, and the reference within the thing is that it was to create energy efficiency packages that were easier to install, better to use, and cheaper for the market. So operating under what was referred to as the IKEA model. Thanks, Steve. Next slide. In the UK, with a sort of a long history of focusing on issues of energy poverty and energy vulnerability, and we identified several case studies, 5 included in the case study analysis. So I'm just going to run through the 4 that were focused on the residential sector, and then introduce one that sits alongside the Portuguese example of one focused on SMEs. So the residential sector examples involved those that were somewhere sitting between, so the first one, somewhere sitting between what would be government-led or government involvement, but all 4 were primarily led by the third sector. So the first one, Big Energy Saving Network, is a nationally led, locally delivered network of energy advice, and it's targeted in the broadest sense to vulnerable energy consumers, and also involved, as mentioned before, which was common across the case studies, an element of training for frontline workers, so really trying to instill this cascade model. Warm Minds focus very specifically on those with mental health issues, dementia and Alzheimer's, and those with learning difficulties, as well as providing support for their carers, and again involve training for frontline workers to really target those that already have experience of working with some of these hard to reach audiences, but to provide that added element of energy awareness and education. The Glusa Comla project focused on rural and remote communities in Western Isles in Scotland, and again drew on the similar sort of underlying aims and principles of the Netherlands project, and was really focused on co-creation and collaboration, so bringing together organisations that were already working in this area and aligning some of that work around goals to tackle poverty, health and poor housing. Empowered by Energy was initially a pilot project a couple of years ago that's now been developed into its second and going into a third year, working with recent refugees. Initially, the target was to work with recent refugees and other migrant communities, but as will be noted later, there was a flexibility adopted early on to broaden this to those with limited English capabilities, really tapping into that hard to reach audience of those with that find accessing or being able to engage in the energy sector in certain countries due to language barriers. Thanks. See you next slide. And as I mentioned, the non-residential example in the UK comes from a team of academics working on promoting sustainability in business, specifically focusing on SMEs. Again, initially set out to develop a set of resources to work with SMEs directly, and the project did so, but broadening this to work with the intermediaries. So again, that's sort of the idea of the cascade model, working with those who are already at the front line, the trusted middle actors, to have a greater reach with the project and the resources that are being developed. This project was particularly interesting because it drew quite heavily on social theory around values and the psychology of values and attitudes, and adopted early on this model of a shift away from prescribing action. So what we should do, what businesses should be doing to move more towards net zero, and understanding how we can better engage in meaningful values-based discussions. So it's not about changing people, it's not about changing their views, attitudes or their values, but about understanding how best to work with their existing values. And I think I'm going to hand back over to C now. Thank you.
Great, and I seem to have forgotten to mute myself again. So I'm now going to talk about the case studies in our financially participating countries, obviously our favourite countries. So in Aotearoa New Zealand, I couldn't really find a good SME example. We did have a great SME Crown program, but I did actually do a case study analysis of that in 2013 for my past IEA task on behaviour change. But it was unfortunately finished and I couldn't find anything similar. So I really focused on the residential sector, but on looking at the different perspectives of different sectors tackling the issue. So I first looked at the Healthy Homes Initiative, which is a very large government-led program that uses trusted community providers all across Aotearoa to provide warm, dry and healthy housing for pregnant women and low-income families with small children 0 to 5 years old who are sick from housing or have other risk factors. So quite strict eligibility criteria, but seeing we have such a big housing issue and health issue in New Zealand, it actually covers quite a lot of people. This initiative is led by the Ministry of Health, but actually involves a lot of different government agencies and works with industry and the community providers and researchers as well. So it's a very solid multi-stakeholder approach. Then I also looked at a pilot by our utility industry, some of our largest energy retailers and lines companies. They developed a pilot called Energy Mate. It provides in-home energy coaching by financial and budgeting mentors to help low-income whānau or families to reduce their energy bills and again get warmer homes. And then I looked at the community sector in Wellington at 2 case studies that were led by the Sustainability Trust. One of them, called Well Homes, was about implementing the Healthy Homes Initiative on the ground, so a regional example of what that actually looks like when it's done on the ground. And the other one was called Warm Fuzzies, and that actually captured those low-income whānau who didn't fall under those eligibility criteria for the Healthy Homes Initiative, and also linked them with existing central government programs, but was specifically focused on energy education and behaviour change. And a few things have already become clear from what you've heard so far, is that even though these programs, especially those here in Aotearoa, are run by different stakeholders with very different mandates and perspectives, they actually target very similar vulnerable households via very similar methods. They use trusted community middle actors, like most of those examples that Danielle has mentioned as well. They train them in home performance advisor training, which is specifically focused on a lower level of energy literacy. So it's not the certified training that's all about kilowatt hours and about calculations and about the technology side of things, but it's very much around training middle actors who may not be energy professionals or housing professionals, but who have completely different mandates to help their clients who also may have quite a low level of energy literacy to start with. They all focus on very similar types of families, and because poor housing and functional and structural overcrowding are such big underlying causes for energy inefficiencies, wasted energy and high utility bills, but also ill health in New Zealand, including shocking rates of rheumatic fever, which pretty much don't exist anywhere else in the Western or developed world. So this poor little girl that you can see in this picture died near Wellington a few years ago because of housing-related chronic respiratory illness, and cases like hers were the reason why there is now such a strong government focus, not government, but also industry and community and research focus in New Zealand on homes and energy hardship. In Sweden, very different kind of axis, very government-led as well, but it's #1 as the best country on the energy poverty index in the world, i.e. it has the lowest rates of energy poverty. And so the focus is a lot more on energy efficiency, on making the housing energy passive or neutral, even positive. And the Swedish focus is generally around creating networks and providing a lot of free energy advice and peer-to-peer platforms. And that is what both of the Swedish examples, the household one and the SME one, talked about. The household one had 4 government actors involved in the implementation. First, the central government, which provided the overarching policies and funding, the Swedish Energy Agency, who administered and coordinated it, then regional energy officers, and finally municipalities, who actually employed the advisors on the ground. And in the energy efficiency network that was run by the Swedish energy agencies to help SMEs to work systematically towards improved energy efficiency and achieve 15% energy efficiency improvements as a result of the implemented measures. So they had over 350 participating programs in 34 networks by the end of it. In the US, quite a different focus again, because our US national expert is representative of the very large utility industry over there. So we have industry programs in Puget Sound in Washington State. They really focused in on manufactured homes, realizing that that again is a big issue for both energy poverty and poor housing. Plus very often also actually Spanish speaking audiences. So they put together a dedicated set of trade allies, again, those trusted middle actors who were already familiar how to work with the intended audiences in that sector. And in the South, in the United States, Duke Energy's had a small business energy saver program, which basically bundled multiple energy saving measures together and promoted them as a kind of one-stop shop to maximize energy savings, whilst also minimizing customer effort, time, and transaction costs, which were found to be big barriers for small businesses. And in Canada, we're looking at British Columbia, where we had a really awesome Indigenous communities program that is still running, that really focused on working with Indigenous communities, particularly in the north, the extreme cold north, to explore the barriers to demand-side management and behaviour change, and test and develop approaches with the community that could help overcome those hurdles. And then more in the southern part of BC, FortisBC worked with small business owners, both on their gas and electric usage, to allow them to complete energy assessments and actually take pledges, which is more of a behavioral economics type of engagement strategy. And I'll hand back to Danielle now to talk about some of the key findings across these case study analyses.
Thanks, Sue. Yeah, so as Sue mentioned earlier, we as a team are in the process at the moment of producing the cross-country case study comparison. And so we just wanted to report on some of the early findings, which I think we've touched on in highlighting some of the key parts of the individual case studies, but just to bring those together now. So in this work so far, we've identified a number of sort of key thematic areas, which fall broadly under 3 areas, and then we've compiled these into an early set of recommendations from these findings. So I'm going to talk about the first 2 areas, design and delivery and engagement strategies, and then I'm going to hand back over to C to discuss some of the barriers in more detail. So in terms of designing and delivering some of these programs to reach the hard to reach audiences, some of the sort of key areas that have come around is the implications of audience heterogeneity and a need for flexibility. So within this, I mentioned earlier that some of the programs sort of set out with initial aims or objectives, and early on had to rethink this, or to think about how that might be broadened to better serve and better reach some of those communities. And some of that implications for developing a program that is feasible and that will work, but also understanding that in terms of inclusion criteria, that may not fit the needs of those that you're trying to support best. In terms of the most effective programs, or how people understood effectiveness in terms of developing and evaluating the programs, there was this real focus on it being person, context, and business specific. So again, when I talked about flexibility, these are some of the sort of criteria or the areas that people thought about when assessing or understanding whether or not their programs have been effective or not. C will be able to talk in more detail about this, but there's a long-standing body of work around changing the behaviour changes, and the evidence from the case study analyses as a whole certainly points towards this as well, and thinking around those that are not necessarily the householders, but those that sit above them or are in communities supporting them. The idea of the need, to work with new hard to reach groups. So we identified across all of the countries some groups that are, as C mentioned, underserved. We know there will be more groups, and trying to understand this. And again, the flexibility will sort of open up some of those avenues to understand which communities or which groups we may not have reached or understood or need to understand better. I didn't mention this earlier, but there was a kind of a tension between in-depth. When we talk about energy advice and support, there's tensions between in-depth provision and that which is lighter touch. So with the national programme in the UK, it was very much modelled as a lighter touch advice programme, but that this wasn't seen to be a bad thing, because for many households, any access to energy advice, support, education, awareness may be the first time that they've had some of these conversations, whether that's about alleviating vulnerability or about making changes for those who are in what we refer to as sort of the able to pay groups. The role of trusted middle actors, we've talked about several times, but is really fundamental to developing some of the most effective programs. And some of the ideas around this, some of the themes that came out around having a single point of contact, which we know is effective in UK policy, but also further afield in some of the case study analysis that we've presented on. The idea of expertise and working towards that. So, for example, we had third sector involvement of those who have decades of experience of working with those with mental health, or working specifically in alleviating poverty, or working with particular communities. And this all being really important for trust. And then the importance in the delivery and the development of these programs around co-design, and having that collaborative element built in from the start. I think C mentioned this as well, but the idea of that balance between behavioural theory and real world insights and experience. So a lot of the case studies, particularly those where they're developed from third sector experience, will draw on real world insights and projects that have been done before, and how that insight and experience may be transferred to subsequent programmes. There is room for more behavioural theory to be embedded, and so programmes like the Promoting Sustainability in Business, the academic example in the UK, are really interesting to better understand how that behavioural theory can be drawn upon. Collaboration essential, as I've mentioned, stronger interagency working, not duplicating efforts, and understanding how we can better complement the work that's being done across different agencies and organisations. Across a number of the studies, the power of the extra stuff, and by stuff I mean things like thermometers, slow cookers, access to small grants, being able to provide stuff, particularly with vulnerable householders, being able to provide things that can reduce some of that immediate crisis, so that you can then engage in some of the more in-depth but maybe less what seems like less of a burning emergency around conversations around whether that's energy switching or renovating and retrofitting houses. Sometimes being able to provide that small grant to clear an energy bill can provide that breathing space. And then evaluation. So we found across it that there were several programs that weren't formally evaluated, but that the program managers, or those developing and delivering it, understood the importance of evaluation. So we need to do more of it, and we need to make the most of what we know. And that kind of falls to us in research communities to better support some of the programs where and how we can. Next slide, please, Steve. Some of common engagement strategies, again, I'm just sort of bringing some of these findings together. We will have touched on all of these. So using trusted middle actors, often community providers or third sector frontline agencies, to recruit and implement strategies, but also important to involve them in that design stage, because those frontline workers, those middle actors, will best understand what engagement strategies work well, and where flexibility is needed. So commonly middle actors trained in specific energy or home performance advice, but not always. So sometimes, as I mentioned, they would work with a mental health charity, or with refugees. And so that was their area of expertise, but they already had a trusted connection with certain communities. So providing that energy education was the fundamental part of that point, of that part of the programme. A real call for the value of face-to-face and in-home advice, particularly for vulnerable energy consumers, but also doing the work in the places where people live out their lives, whether that's in their homes or in their community centres, places where they access on a day-to-day basis. So the importance of going to the communities and hard-to-reach groups that you want to engage with. And energy efficiency, often not the primary driver when communicating messages. So as the example I used in the previous slide, often it can be about alleviating crisis, or it could be about understanding business needs and business challenges, and understanding values through that, and then making that conversation fit with the importance of energy and energy needs. Next slide, Sia. I think I'm handing back to Sia now. Yes, thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Danielle. So some of the main barriers that we found were about actually identifying and recruiting those hard to reach households and small business owners, because guess what? They're hard to reach. And that is where those trusted community middle actors were absolutely crucial. And we can't say it often enough, but they are also hard to reach because they are so under the gun, they're so under-resourced. Energy advice is not the primary mandate. They often don't actually know much about energy and housing themselves. And if you don't have trusted long-term relationships already established with them, you can't just pick up the phone and ring them and go, hey, I want to train you in energy efficiency and talk to your clients. That is just not going to happen. So trust is definitely one of the biggest barriers, both with the energy end users and with the middle actors. And so it's really important that we start working on building up the trust over time, and that goes for industry, government, and research actors, all of whom are kind of a bit siloed from the real world in that sense. It's also important to not conflate low-income households with being vulnerable and or hard to reach. There is definitely a big overlap in the Venn diagram, but they shouldn't be conflated, because it may be very easy to actually identify and target low-income households, but once they have compounding and intersecting vulnerabilities, they become harder and harder to reach. And it's those vulnerabilities that often fall through the cracks in energy efficiency and demand-side programs, or who may actually make things worse. So for example, and I've seen some questions coming in already that are like, what are the energy savings? In a lot of these cases, we are not actually too worried about the energy or kilowatt hour savings, because we do not want that the energy saving advice undermines health issues, because a lot of those households are already doing what they can to save energy, and it's very often at the detriment of their health. They're very often not using heating. They're very often doing things that actually makes their health worse, because they don't understand the connection between poor housing and energy use and health. And so energy saving messages may be less important to those kind of households, or even businesses as well, than the health advice that's around staying warm and dry. For SMEs, it's really important to acknowledge how heterogeneous they are, and that one size really does not fit all, which is often why they also fall through the cracks, because they just get put in the too hard baskets. But they can definitely be helped a lot, but it does need to be a more tailored and more complex kind of targeted intervention than what we're used to. And what we found in our studies is that market barriers and failures, such as information asymmetries, lack of knowledge, lack of finance, lack of long-term vision, and strategic approaches, and very low priority given to energy efficiency. Those were kind of the main barriers. And that is something that again needs to be built up with energy education and literacy over time, and trust. So the top recommendations, just to bring it home yet again: build ongoing trust relationships with community middle actors who know those hard to reach energy users much better than we ever will. Use co-design principles with multiple stakeholders, including end user representatives. Dedicate the correct budget to compensate those middle actors, build their resources, build their capacity, help them actually be able to be empowered and trained so that they can provide energy behavior and healthy homes advice on top of all the other really important services that they provide, like those crisis services that Danielle talked about. Clearly define your target audience and tailor your target behaviors to their needs. For example, I had some questions: what are the activities that are carried out in those homes? Some of them are just about energy education and simple behavior changes, energy saving stuff that they can do. It's about teaching them that they have an appliance bucket and a hot water bucket, and they can save energy in those two buckets in order to spend it on the healthy energy bucket, which is around warmth, around dry houses, around reducing mold and humidity, etc., for example. Or it can be helping them to retrofit or apply to government programs, or it can be things like in New Zealand, a lot of bedding is given out because a lot of these homes don't actually have beds that are not wet and full of mold. So some of our actual healthy home initiative stuff isn't about energy, but it's about bedding and helping them to actually keep their beds dry. And that is the most important thing you can do to help them. It's really important to use simple communication methods involving both traditional and social media. And yes, use behavioral science to inform your messaging if you can, if you have that expertise, but very important, mostly rely on your middle actors' practical knowledge of their clients, because they know better than any of us researchers ever will what those clients need and how they want to be communicated with. Pilot prototyping testing before you roll something out is great if you can afford it. Evaluating, super important, process outcome and impact, then reiterate where needed, and also really importantly, tell stories and highlight non-energy benefits like health and social outcomes, particularly to your funders as well. As much as the Treasury Department usually just wants to hear about, monetary saving or kilowatt hour savings or whatever, politicians in particular are actually very open to hearing some stories, especially if they're really big horror stories about what's happening to their constituents and how they can be helped. And then in terms of policy, it's important to dedicate specific energy efficiency and renewable energy and demand side policies to vulnerable consumers and small and medium enterprises in parallel with financial aids to help pay their bills. So what's next with our task? Last minute. We are doing a cross-country case study analysis, which is currently in prep. We are also writing 2 CEEE summer study papers and hopefully have our first face-to-face workshop in the south of France in the middle of the year, if possible. We'll see. We are also undertaking some field research pilots, one that's already underway in Aotearoa New Zealand, where we developed an improved home energy assessment toolkits. That is an intervention package that is geared specifically at the most vulnerable whānau and at training those middle actors who are working with them in their communities and providing solutions to the assessment that they carry out themselves and learn about their home's energy use and the health performance. And then hopefully in Canada and BC Hydro, we are going to deliver some empathy training for low-income home energy advisors. And finally, we're also going to come out with some country reports for each of our financially participating countries. And now I'm going to hand over to Sam to tell you a little bit about the Users Technology Collaboration Program, but please put some questions into the Q&A so we can have a bit more of a chat after Sam. And you can also contact me here and please check out our project. And I'm just going to hand over to Sam right now and then come back to you to answer some questions.
Thank you, C. Great presentation, C, and Danielle. Lots of really useful case studies, I think, there for policymakers, particularly in the EU, actually, where I'm based, because we have new proposals for the Energy Efficiency Directive, which is going to require all member states to deliver a proportion of their energy savings obligations amongst energy poor households. And so I think there's lots and lots of really useful information that I think could be super valuable for policymakers here as they work out how to try and reach their new obligations. Now, as C said, the hard to reach task is just one of the international research collaborations operating under the Users TCP umbrella. But what is the Users TCP, you might ask? Well, we are an international technology collaboration program operating under the auspices of the International Energy Agency, and TCP stands for Technology Collaboration Program. Now, there are 38 of these TCPs focused on different topics, from wind to solar thermal to all sorts of different technologies. And together we connect thousands of experts across government, academia and industry in 55 countries dedicated to advancing energy technology research and application. Now, the Users TCP, that's us, we've got 15 member countries across Europe, North America, Asia and Australasia, as well as the Copper Alliance, who we partner with to deliver this Academy series. And our mission is to provide evidence from socio-technical research on the design, social acceptance and usability of clean energy technologies to inform policymaking for clean, efficient and secure energy transitions. So we're very different actually from most of the other TCPs in that we are socio-technical as opposed to focusing on individual technology types. And we bring together researchers from different disciplines with policymakers and industry to make sure that the best advice is available to our member governments and industry sponsors. Now, our projects or tasks, and you can see a few of them at the bottom of the screen there, involve researchers, policymakers, industry reps from across our member countries, and range from projects that are more social science based. So we have a behavioral insight platform, which brings together policymakers to share knowledge on how to apply the lessons from behavioral research to energy and climate policy making, to more technical work. For example, we have a global observatory on peer-to-peer energy trading and community self-consumption, which we call Go P2P. And we have C's work here, where we're joining together researchers, project implementers, utilities working on energy efficiency, and a whole bunch of other projects where you as researchers, I mean, I see we've got quite a few researchers on the call, may be able to get involved. We're currently developing a new collaboration around public engagement around net zero, and I would welcome any of your interest in getting involved with that or any of the work of the TCP in general. You can see my contact details there, s.thomas@userstcp.org. Just get in touch if you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved in our international research collaborations. And with that, I'll pass back to Hans, who will curate the Q&A as I see we've got lots of questions coming in.